Hey, everybody. Unfortunately, there is no actual advice about escaping from prison, so I'm glad you've all actually managed to get out of prison already. Molto grazie a tutti for coming. My Italian is really terrible, so I'm not going to try to subject you guys to more than that, but I do want to thank you all for sticking around for the last talk of the day. So I am here to tell you guys that Xcode is my frenemy. I have a serious love-hate relationship with Xcode because there are so many wonderful and amazing things that it can do, and then there are so many maddeningly frustrating things it can do. And the biggest of these things that it can do that really frustrates me is crash. And since we just finished beta season, it's that like wonderful time of the year where it's like, okay, now it's not crashing as much. And that's been a thing that's annoyed me. And about 2013, during the earliest days of Xcode 5, myself and several of my colleagues at work started a Tumblr. As at the time, that was what you did with things that annoyed you. And we called it Xcode has crashed. And so we started taking screenshots of these little Xcode quit unexpectedly things. My favorite joke about this is that nothing ever crashes with Apple. It only quits unexpectedly. So there was a point where a car quit unexpectedly into the Apple store in Chicago. So whenever it would crash, we would make these snarky little comments in the crash box like, oh, you know, I tried to select the name of a framework I wanted to remove, and apparently I can check in anytime I like, but I can never leave. It's the Hotel Xcodefornia. And my friends kind of got tired of it within about 3 or 4 months, and I've still been doing this for the last 3.5 years. So there are a lot more of these. If you're interested, please feel free to submit. I know you'll eventually get something that you want to submit because as iOS developers, we tend to love to hate Xcode. But I think this is because what we've really wanted to do all along is to get it to behave the way that we wanted to do it. And the level of customization that can be achieved out of the box is pretty low. So the solution that some adventurous developers found by poking around in the internals of Xcode was this undocumented private API that allowed you to create plugins. And these would be loaded up when Xcode started, and you could extend or enhance Xcode however you wanted. So one of the first plugins to really gain a lot of traction was actually a plugin to help you manage your plugins, which was called Yo Dog, I heard you like plugins, so I made a plugin to manage your plugins. No, actually, it was called Alcatraz. And it's a package manager for Xcode plugins. Marian Usalj, hope I pronounced that right, started this up in about April of 2013. And it quickly became the default way to install plugins. So before Alcatraz, plugins had to be downloaded from source and built, and then you had to quit and relaunch Xcode to run them. And with Alcatraz, you were able to get this constantly updated list of available plugins, and eventually support was added for themes and templates as well. So the problem was that the plugin system was never officially documented, and so building plugins was kind of a kludge. Even when NS Hipster wrote an article that brought a lot of attention to the plugins in April of 2014, the best advice that Matt with 3Ts had at the time was to class dump the Xcode app bundle in order to figure out what you could do. You could get a plugin up and running by using a template that Delissa Mason, who's better known as Catrali, she had put up on GitHub after being driven utterly nuts trying to get started with this. And this is where I sort of came into the wonderful world of Xcode plugins. I used this to build up a plugin that I called Xcode Auto Basher, which watched files or folders within the current open project or projects, and then it ran a given script whenever there were changes. So whenever the core data model changed, I would run MoGenerator, which automatically generates a bunch of convenient stuff for core data. And then I had another utility that I had made that went through an asset catalog and generated a bunch of UI image code. And so being able to set all this up so that all I had to do was just drop an image in or make a change to core data and those things would automatically update was awesome. And it was really, really helpful. And it also allowed me to share everything that I had set up with members of my team. A friend of mine from work helped me out on this. His name is Isaac Greenspan. He's really good. And he helped come up with a system that actually generated a plist that we could sync through Git so that anybody in our team who was using this plugin was able to have all of those scripts run automatically, which was really cool. And not that long after that is when the end of the fun came upon us. Because in September of 2015, a pretty massive security hole was revealed by a piece of malware called Xcode Ghost. Since Xcode itself was not code signed at the time, a maliciously crafted version started making the rounds, which automatically injected spyware into anything that it signed. And this spread really, really quickly because the enormous size of the download for Xcode and really slow internet in China led a lot of Chinese devs to download it from file sharing sites and then just pass it around on a thumb drive. Another thing around the same time that sort of snuck out was that documents from the Edward Snowden leak showed that the United States National Security Agency had managed to make a compromised version of Xcode that they called Strawhorse. Strawhorse was able to create and re-sign apps in a way which basically sent everything that was supposed to be encrypted on the phone to whoever the person running that version of Xcode wanted. Given that it was the National Security Agency that ran that version of Xcode, you can guess where that went. Apple had a complete freak out about this. In my opinion, rightly so. Xcode Ghost was a pretty serious security breach, and Strawhorse had the potential to allow governments to really easily spy on their citizens. And so, particularly when Xcode Ghost was exposed, Apple removed everything that was affected by it in the App Store. And there was at least one framework vendor that was affected by it, so it wasn't even just your code that you had to check, it was the code of every single dependency that you had to check. But between Ghost and Strawhorse, Apple's most immediate and obvious decision was to start code signing Xcode with Xcode 8. And so that developers could much more easily validate whether they were running an original or altered version of the program. And from a security standpoint, you can now no longer use Alcatraz in Xcode 8. There's just no supporting something like that with code signing, which is really unfortunate. Now, you can theoretically run it if you break Xcode's code signing, but by doing that, you put yourself at the risk of exploits like Xcode Ghost and Strawhorse. So Apple had a whole lot of developer interest in extending Xcode, so they knew they had to provide something. They also didn't have a lot of time. So at WWDC 2016, they announced new Xcode extensions. And there's good news and bad news. I'm going to start with the good news. There are a lot of benefits to the new system, the biggest of which is that it is officially supported. This is going to take a lot of the nonsense out of trying to develop things which modify Xcode. One of the things that drove me absolutely bananas about developing an Xcode plugin through the old method was that you had to update this developer tools compatibility identifier with every minor point release of Xcode because plugins wouldn't run on those versions unless they were updated to have that compatibility identifier. And it was also annoying if you used more than a couple of plugins to bug every single developer and be like, hey, guys, did you update it? Did you update it? Did you update it? And that was really, really annoying. So you don't have to deal with any of this nonsense anymore. Another nice thing is that we have a documented API. Like I said, previously you basically had to class dump Xcode and kind of figure it out from there to be able to do anything. Now there's a framework called Xcode Kit that Apple created to handle all of this stuff. And it was pretty amusing over the summer because the docs didn't get generated until Xcode 8 went Gold Master, which led to some pretty amusing documentation where it's like, yeah, I'm not sure. No overview available. But the good news is they now do have it running, and it's providing real information about what's going on with everything that's public in Xcode Kit. If your internet connection is crappy, there's also inline documentation on pretty much everything that you're going to want to use if you just command-click into the headers. So how do you actually build an extension? You make a host Mac app. So in order to make an extension, you have to, by definition, be extending something. So you need to have that Mac application that will run on the Mac that will be able to be picked up by Xcode. Now, your host Mac application doesn't actually have to do anything, but it has to at least exist for you to be able to add an extension target. And you create that extension target in Xcode. So once you've actually gone and created your Mac application, sort of host application, you go in, you add a new target, and then you'll see this lovely menu with a whole lot of templates. Apple added a ton of extension points for iOS 10 and macOS Sierra. So you want to make sure that you have macOS selected, and then go to the bottom of the alphabet where Xcode always lives, and select the Xcode source editor extension. So when you hit next from this screen, you do the whole, like, I'm going to name this thing. And then you will get a target with just a couple of files that have the two major pieces of what constitute an extension. So you have XC source editor extension. So this is a protocol that identifies the class that is called when Xcode actually fires up and can optionally implement a couple of things. Then there's also XC source editor command. So this is what actually gets called when the user invokes your extension. So you've got all that ready. Like, okay, I want to sort of see what this does right out of the box. You have to do a little bit of preparation for launch, especially if you are on El Capitan. So if you're on El Cap, you have to run this weird sudo command to basically tell it that, like, hey, I want to do extensions because I like them. And then you have to reboot your computer. And when you reboot your computer, everything will magically work. So I guess, have you tried turning it off and on again is now apparently an official part of the Apple documentation. If you're on Sierra, you don't have to worry about that. This is all already taken care of for you. So after you reboot it, pick out the extension scheme, you run it, and it launches a second instance of Xcode that's grayed out so that you know it's the debug version, which is really helpful. And this is also something that's very different from the old way of doing Xcode plugins because, again, you had to build. You had to run. You had to look at all the logs that you put in to figure out what the hell was going on. And then you had to go back and you had to build and run and restart Xcode again every single time. Now you can actually have a application that you can debug in real time. You can set breakpoints in your main Xcode, and then when they're hit in the debug version of Xcode, you can actually see exactly what's going on. So that's really, really awesome. It even grays out the bar of a playground or a project, so you can tell for sure which version of Xcode you're using on a particular thing. So I'm going to talk through some sample code that I wrote for this talk, which I originally gave it at iOS Dev UK. And because of that, I decided to take one of my favorite jokes about British and American English, which is that you have original English, or UK English, and simplified English, which is American English. And so I made a little demo, and I'm going to try to show that to you guys now. So let's see. Now I just have to figure out where my mouse is. And so you'll notice that, so in this thing, this is called flavor, and it's spelled F-L-A-V-O-R, F-L-A-V-O-U-R, because depending on how you want to pronounce it, it's either flavor or flavor. So I wanted something that would just have a really simple thing that you could see to see how this can work. So I made a nice little Mac application, and then I will build that and run it. And whoop, did it actually show up there? Yay! So this is the host Mac application. It really doesn't do very much, but it'll come back in a minute. And then I go to the extension, build and run the extension. It'll ask you what app you want to run. Make sure if you have more than one version of Xcode, you actually pick the right one. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But so that is going to launch. Whoop. My doc that has too much stuff in it. And now you can see that we had a little thing here that says, oh, extension did finish launching, even though I haven't actually done anything with the extension yet, and I'll get back to why that is in a second. So if you select the darkened version of Xcode, and I have a little example called Extension Test Playground, and it will, of course, open on the wrong screen. Ta-da! So I have this thing that says the flavor of this color allows the behavior to center before the beginning of the program. And it is something where I'm like, okay, well, I want to see what's going on here. So where all Xcode source extensions will wind up living in the menu is in the editor menu. And you'll see them down at the bottom here, and you'll see that I have flavor, and it can do US to UK or UK to US. And so if I can actually sort of make this a little bit smaller, and then pull that up, what you'll be able to see is that when I invoke it, it says, okay, I want to take this US stuff and make it UK. Yay! So now the flavor of this color allows behavior to Santra before the beginning of the program. And then you can see that in the application it says the last translation was Merkin to British. And then if you do it again, and you say, okay, now that it's British, I would like to make it American. Hey, the flavor of this color allows the behavior to center before the beginning of the program. So, yay! And one thing that you can notice is that because it is specifically checking for comments, it's not changing the name of UIColor or the color variable that I have there. So that's sort of a really, really basic idea of what these things can do. There's tons and tons of stuff that's going on. So I want to walk you guys through sort of like, how does this work? So I will start with the source editor extension. So this class, the source editor extension, it defines the source editor extension. And the main way that it does that is by implementing the XC source editor extension protocol. Now you can have this thing that says extension did finish launching, and you can do anything that you want in here that happens when Xcode actually loads this extension up. So like grabbing settings or doing any kind of prep work, any kind of warm-up that needs to happen with a database or anything. But it's really not going to have a ton of time to do that. You also have a command definitions variable that you can override. So most stuff is in info plist for your extension. You've got all these lovely teeny tiny things that I'm sure you guys can see super well, like XC source editor command definitions, the source editor command name, and the command identifier, all those kind of things. That's sort of how you set up those menu items in Xcode that will show up. If you want to do it dynamically at runtime, you override this thing. And then you have the source editor command. So this is what actually gets triggered when you are doing that little selection. So it doesn't do any, again, the class itself doesn't do anything except to conform to the protocol. So in this case, what's happening here is that when this is being performed, it's going through and it's grabbing the last component of the command identifier to figure out whether it's supposed to do US to UK or UK to US. And then it goes and it looks at the invocation.buffer.lines. So when you get the invocation, you get a buffer of sort of what all the text is, and you can either deal with it as like one giant blob of text, or you can deal with it in a line-by-line fashion. Apple really recommends that you do that in the line-by-line fashion because basically it is a hell of a lot faster for them to replace only the lines that have changed rather than just basically redoing the whole thing in one go. So going through, making sure that I can actually grab a string out of it, see if it's a comment. If it's not a comment, then move on. And then it looks for various incorrect spellings and then replaces them with the correct spelling. And then if the updated line is the same as the original line, then it doesn't need to do anything. And then if it is updated, then it replaces the object at that index, and you're good to go. And then, this is a fun thing. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with a library called Wormhole. It's written by some guys out of Texas called Mutual Mobile, and it is a really, really nice wrapper for iOS that allows you to have simple notification communication that goes through the Darwin Notification Center, which is all in super lovely C. And just to give you a lovely idea of what that looks like, it's like, oh yeah, CF Notification Center, get Darwin Notify Center, and all sorts of string bridging and things like that. So I lifted the C code out of what they're doing because it's not compatible with Mac OS. But basically what you can do is you can use that Darwin Notification Center to set up ways for you to send that information to your application immediately, so that you can see, and you can see that feature where this little arrow actually switches back and forth. So once the notification is actually sent, then that actually goes over into the view controller, which has registered for, so that notification center wrapper is listening for a couple of different things, and then it's listening, and then it's also listening for an NS notification that CF notification wrapper thing is sending out. Basically, the CF notification wrapper you don't have to worry too much about. It's mostly an abstraction to like get all the C code out of the way, because C and Swift are not always friends. And what you can basically do is have a really, really simple NS notification that you work with that just comes through, and you can take that information and then you can do stuff in your Mac app with it, which allows you to work around some of the more annoying restrictions of what you can actually do with a extension. So that's sort of a basic walkthrough of what you can do with an extension. I am going to find my mouse again. So I want to also note that because this is a Mac app, you can distribute it like any other Mac app. You can actually distribute it through the Mac App Store or just sign for developer release outside the Mac App Store. One thing I'm not super clear on that I'll say up front is that I'm not sure whether the Mac App Store policy about like, well, you can't have an app that doesn't do anything is being enforced around things which are Xcode source editor extensions. Sort of the canonical example that Apple gives for what the associated app would do is like, oh, it has preferences, so you can change whatever you want in there. But I really haven't seen if it is something where if it's similar to what I've been doing, is that enough functionality for Apple to be like, yeah, sure, come on into the Mac App Store, yay. So yeah. So now that we've talked about what these extensions can do, it is time to talk about their limitations. There are a lot of limits on extensions, some of which are very understandable and annoying, but others of which are just horrifying. So from a scale of meh to here are a few things that I found really limiting about Xcode extensions. They're sandboxed and code signed. There are some things you can work around with the Darwin Notification Center and entitlements, but for the most part, Sandbox is here to kill your dreams. I completely understand why Apple did this. These were two of the worst case scenarios you could possibly imagine that both happened within about a month of each other. And so I feel like this was a totally reasonable response. Another thing that's really annoying, there's no way to set the default key binding that can be used as a shortcut to fire up your extension. The user actually has to define that themselves every single time. So my guess as to why they did that is to prevent possible collisions where multiple extensions might have the same default shortcut. But as a user, it's really obnoxious to have to set the key bindings individually every single time. And it's also really annoying because of the next issue, which is that extensions have to be invoked by the user. The user either has to use the key binding that they've set up or use that editor submenu that I showed you guys in order to actually get the extension to run. There's nothing where you can watch the user typing and be like, hey, you spelled that wrong, or hey, you're not following code guidelines. You have to have the user stop and explicitly invoke what you're trying to do. And I find like that kills off a ton of really, really useful functionality, especially in the area of automatic boilerplate generation. No user interface. You can't present any user interface. So something like a picker that allows you to select from a set of already localized strings, or something that lets you select a color from a palette, nope, dead. No access to the file or the project structure. There's no way to make a plugin that does anything regarding manipulating that stuff, like trying to make your file system structure and your project structure match, which is a thing that I know Venmo has a thing for, and it would be great if you could just do that with an extension. Nope. The one that really bothers me is that you can't emit warnings, because it really kneecaps extension ideas for things which warn you when you have done something stupid. And as somebody who does a lot of stupid things, I like it when I have a robot that tells me, hey, you did something stupid, change it. At least with linters, you can update your text to match the linting rules. But it's really, really hard to actually get anything to cough up warnings in a way that's actually going to be useful, especially because you only get one file of text at a time. So I like to move on to what is always my favorite part of a presentation, where I reveal that as much as I sound like I know what I'm doing, I'm secretly a complete moron. Luckily for you, I'm going to enumerate the ways in which I was a moron so that you can look very smart to all of your friends and colleagues by not doing any of the dumb things I did. So the first one mostly applies if you've done plugin development before. I forgot to install the old plugin tools. I left the old template that I had downloaded for Alcatraz installed, and I hadn't realized it. And so when I went to start this project, I had this total brain fart about needing a Mac app, and I saw it, and I looked at this list, and I saw, oh, the old template. It's got like this nice, shiny, Apple-looking thing, and I can click on that. So instead of creating a Mac app, I clicked on that, and that was a really dumb idea. What was an even dumber idea was getting really pissed off about it and filing a couple of radars about it that I had to close out with a somewhat chagrined apology to the Apple engineers I'd had running in circles. I said, closing as, holy shit, I'm an idiot. So yeah, remember, Mac app first, then extension. Anything else will bring you pain. Speaking of pain, I also forgot to enable code signing. So for the first several betas, you could just use unsigned plugins for development, but since beta 6, you have had to have code signing for everything. The thing that's really annoying about it is that if you don't have code signing enabled, the way that it tells you is it doesn't do anything. They will only let you know with a message that is logged to the console. And everybody who has been working with Xcode 8 for the last couple of months knows that you have trained yourself to completely ignore everything happening in the console because it has got more vomit in it than a fraternity house on a Saturday night. So, yeah. Thank you. So yeah, I mentioned this. I launched the wrong version of Xcode. When you go to debug your extension, you're going to get a dialog that asks what application you want to launch, to which you say, duh, Xcode. And the problem is that if you have more than one version of Xcode, especially if you're doing what I'm doing now, where I have Xcode and Xcode 7, both of which have the same icon, but when they get into this particular dialog, they both are called Xcode and they both have an identical icon. When I tried to run it on Xcode 7, which doesn't support extensions, it understandably freaked out. And you have to, at the time, I had to sort of scroll all the way down to get to the 8 beta so that it would launch. And at least with the 8 beta, it has a little like red tag on it so you can tell that it's a beta. And once you've selected it, then it comes back up to the top. It's like, oh yeah, I remember what that is. And it was helpful, but I thought, wouldn't it be really nice if you could avoid this completely? And good news, you can avoid this completely. I finally had an opportunity to watch Dan Jalkett's talk from Try Swift New York, which I missed because I was actually frantically working on my own talk at the time. And I picked up this really awesome tip on how to avoid this entirely. So in the run section of your extension scheme, by default, when it's created, it should launch the executable. It should launch is set to ask on the launch. Overall, pretty dumb because obviously these things only run in Xcode. But as you saw, if you're like me and you have an older version of Xcode, it is really easy to pick the wrong one. So what you can do is you can select this other thing, and that will launch a chooser that actually goes into your file system and shows you the names of things as you have named or renamed them, rather than as Apple deems them to be named. So that is really helpful so that you can actually tell the difference between Xcode and Xcode 7. And then when you're done, you never have to worry about it again because that version will automatically be selected. Dan also reminded me of one other thing, which is that you can pass a file path as a launch argument so that that file is launched when you run the scheme. So in the Arguments tab, if you give a argument passed on launch of a path that's relative to the source root, you can have that file launch immediately. So I'm going to do a little mini demo because you guys saw the super kludgy way that this worked before. And so I'm going to try to use Dan's way and make it much less crappy. So I'm going to go in, and I'm going to edit the scheme, applications, Xcode, and then where'd it go? Arguments. And you can add any full path to this, but adding something that's starting with source root is helpful because then that way anybody else who's looking at this will be able to do this as well. So it was Xcode. Sorry, let's see. Extension test playground. All right. Excuse me. So now, if I close out the old sort of version of Xcode, now when I actually launch this, it will go, it launches, and it opens the file right up. Much, much easier. Excuse me. Oh boy. Give me 1 sec. Asthma, it's the best. So apparently I'm just going to have a slightly higher voice for a minute here. We've actually gotten to the end of my talk, so basically I wanted to give everybody a little overview. Alcatraz is dead. That sucks, but what are you going to do? Xcode extensions are officially supported. Yay. Xcode extensions have to have a Mac OS app, and they're kind of limited. The app doesn't actually have to do anything, which is great. And you should file radars. The Xcode team has been really, really active on Twitter saying, like, hey, if there's stuff that's missing, please let us know. Because they basically had to put this together very quickly before the release of Xcode 8. So they're really excited to hear what the next thing that people are interested in doing is and trying to enable it. So code is available on GitHub. And there should be an E on the end of example. I'll post these slides with a corrected URL on SpeakerDeck. And yeah, does anybody have any questions?